They've been called controlled collisions. Approaching at speeds of more than 140 miles per hour and sink rates of over 20 feet per second, naval combat aircraft must repeatedly slam onto carrier decks and be hauled within seconds to an abrupt stop. They have to be rugged to withstand this type of punishment. Their structural strength translates into added weight, which cuts down on performance, range, and load-carrying capability. How rugged is rugged enough? Or what about carrier launches? A catapult, a mechanical slingshot, can hurl an airplane from 0 to 140 miles per hour within 2.5 seconds. How do you ensure smooth, fully controllable flight as the airplane quickly transitions from wheels and flaps down to a clean configuration and the aerodynamic forces change in volume and intensity at an incredible rate? Though unique to naval operations, these are only a couple of the myriad of questions that aircraft designers must consider as they attempt to hone their craft into something better, more effective than anything which has preceded it. An incredibly complex array of factors come into play as they attempt to overcome problems impacting airspeed, maneuverability, range, weapons delivery, systems integration, maintainability, and, the bottom line, cost and schedule. All of these and a host of other questions must be answered to the designer's satisfaction before he can answer that most important question of all. Will his design meet the requirements? Will it get the job done? This man answered those questions about as well as anyone in his profession ever has. One of the most prolific and innovative designers of all time, Edward H. Ed Heinemann was regarded as the master of fundamental simplicity in aircraft design, and the family of airplanes he built established him as one of the true giants in the world of aviation. Not bad for a man who quit high school in 1925 to pursue a career as a draftsman. Within a year, he found himself working at the Douglas Aircraft Company in Los Angeles. The aviation industry was in response to a 1933 Navy request for a low-wing monoplane fighter. Northrop conceived the XFT-1 as a scaled-down version of the Delta. and for the first time gave Ed Heinemann the job of project engineer and responsibility for detailed design. At 235 miles per hour, the XFT-1 easily proved to be the fastest aircraft in the competition, but marginal handling qualities cost Northrop the contract. The XFT-1 served as the basis for the Model 3A, a proposed Army fighter. Ed Heinemann actually completed the detailed design and construction of this airplane all within 30 days. Featuring retractable landing gear, the 3A also boasted exceptional performance and impressive 279 miles per hour, but it too suffered from marginal stability. Even though neither of these forays into combat design were successful, they served as a useful proving ground for the young designer, and even while they were still underway, he was already at work on a design building airplanes that would meet very palpable customer requirements, and he opted to remain at Douglas working on the XBT-2, a much modified BT-1 airframe featuring fully retractable landing gear and a far more powerful engine, and promising significantly higher speed and greater range and weapons carrying. Release its bomb with pinpoint accuracy. Miles, nearly triple that of the BT-1, and an increase of more than 3,000 pounds in max load carrying capability. The Dauntless represented a virtual quantum leap over its predecessor. Moreover, all of the painstaking work on its configuration produced an airplane with incomparable question for any combat aircraft is, can it get the job done? Following Pearl Harbor, the mighty Japanese fleet had expanded its conquests over the entire Western Pacific. Numerically far superior to the now mangled American fleet, it appeared to be almost invincible. The Japanese High Command planned for a decisive battle in the late spring of 1942, which would force the U.S. to sue for peace. Their plan? To attack the island of Midway and thereby draw the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement, which would result in its destruction. In early June, a massive armada, including 4 Japanese carriers, steamed toward Midway. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, however, The Navy had deciphered their codes, and though vastly outnumbered in terms of firepower, had 3 carriers lying in wait, hoping to spring a trap. Ed Heinemann was later to observe that the Dauntless turned out to be the right plane at the right place for the right war. On that violent June day, it certainly was. The rugged SBDs and their courageous crews were responsible for sinking all 4 Japanese carriers in a battle which had indeed the offensive forever. Even if Ed Heinemann and the Dauntless had never achieved anything else, they would have established their importance in history just on the basis of this single battle. But the SBD, which is generally regarded as the finest dive bomber ever built, went on to be one of only 2 naval combat aircraft that saw action throughout the entire war. And it was responsible for sinking more enemy tonnage in the Pacific than any other single weapon. And Heinemann? Well, even before the SBD had triumphed at Midway, there were other Heinemann-conceived airplanes already in action. Back in 1936, he'd conceived the Model 7A as a high-performance, land-based light bomber capable of speeds in excess of 250 miles per hour. As this design was under development, however, the Army Air Corps changed its tactical requirements, asking for greater range and doubling the bomb load to 1,200 pounds. Thus, the 7A was transformed into the Model 7B prototype by late 1938. By that time, the storm clouds of war were gathering over Europe, and the French ordered 100, and then 170 more, which went into service as the DB-7 in 1939. These aircraft entered combat against the Germans in May of 1940, and after the fall of France, were transferred to the Royal Air Force, which flew them in great numbers throughout the rest of the war. They came into service with the U.S. Army Air Forces as the A-20 Havoc in late 1940. Capable of speeds well in excess of 300 miles per hour, and serving principally as low-level attack bombers and potent gun platforms, Havocs were employed by 9 different air forces in every theater of operations throughout the war. To the crews of all nationalities who flew them into combat, the Havoc's exceptional handling qualities and inherent ruggedness in the hostile low-level environment were a godsend. Among them, it earned admiring respect because of its ability to put its weapons on target, take an incredible amount of punishment, and still bring its crews home. It was this ability to get the job done, a characteristic of all Ed Heinemann airplanes, that led to a production run of nearly 7,400 airplanes, more than any other aircraft produced by Douglas during World War II. Much of the success of this and succeeding programs was due in no small part to Heinemann's ability to put a development team together and use it effectively. He believed in delegating authority and responsibility. Like all great designers, he could be stubborn, even rigid, when it came to demanding very thorough and exacting engineering standards, and he always had the final say on any important issue. But the basis for his approach to any problem was to build consensus among all involved, so they'd work together effectively toward a common goal. He often remarked that perhaps the most important key to his success was his ability to select and hire good people, and then make the best use of each of their individual talents. Shortly after becoming chief engineer, he brought Leo Devlin on board to help with the Havoc program. Devlin would remain as his second in command for the next 2 decades. Hank Holden and Al Leonhardt would come on board shortly thereafter, and all of them would stay. By the early 50s, in fact, the group came to be known as the Four Horsemen of El Segundo. Even as the earliest model A-20s were coming off the production line, the Army Air Forces expressed interest in a light bomber featuring heavier armament, more strength, more speed, and better performance. While many within the company argued that the A-20 could be upgraded, Heinemann held out for an entirely new airplane, and within 2 weeks delivered a concept for a heavier, though only slightly larger airplane with increased speed, range, and performance, and able to carry more than double the payload. To improve stability and control for combat air crews flying on the deck, he incorporated a new laminar flow wing into the design of an aircraft that would become famous as the A-26 Invader. A-26s didn't enter combat in numbers until late 1944, but performing both low-level attack and medium-altitude precision bombing missions, they quickly earned a reputation as the Air Force's most effective twin-engine bombers. Indeed, the Air Force was so impressed that the Invader was chosen as the standard light bomber for the post-war force. A decision which proved wise when in June of 1950, the North Koreans spilled over the 38th parallel. In Korea, more than a decade after it was first conceived, the recently redesignated B-26 flew both the first and last combat missions of the war, and in between, it proved to be an awesomely effective platform as it performed interdiction missions against enemy troop and supply movements, both during the day and at night. Remarkably, in an age when jets were taking over the skies, some 400 of these vintage prop airplanes flew more than 70,000 combat missions. To ruggedness and effectiveness, Ed Heinemann would be able to add the word durable to the list of adjectives describing his designs. But the Invader wasn't done yet. A small number were modified to perform counterinsurgency missions in the Vietnam conflict of the 60s, and thus this remarkable craft could lay claim to being the only American airplane ever to see combat service in 3 different wars. As the Invaders were still rolling off the production line back in 1944, Heinemann was facing a dilemma, the strong possibility that Douglas El Segundo would soon be without a major production contract. He'd designed a follow-on to the Dauntless, the Gullwing 2-seat XSB-2D, but built according to specs laid down before the war and loaded down with systems required by the Navy, it was already obsolete by the time it first flew in early 1943. At the Navy's request, he'd modified the design into the BTD-1, a single-seat torpedo bomber which first flew in March of 1944. He was well aware, however, that this airplane would be outclassed by competing aircraft designed from the outset as single-seaters. And thus, at a meeting with Navy officials in Washington in June 1944, he made a bold proposal to cancel the BTD and allow him to use the remaining funds to design an entirely new airplane. All he'd need to complete the initial concept design would be about 30 days. The Navy was intrigued, but gave him less than 20 hours to come up with concept drawings and weight and performance estimates. That night, Heinemann, Leo Devlin, and aerodynamicist Gene Root worked feverishly in a hotel room to complete the task. And by 3 a.m., Heinemann had sketched out the concept drawings for an airplane that epitomized his commitment to the precepts of simplicity and practicality. He got the go-ahead, but had only 9 months, 6 months less than his competitors, to put an airplane on the ramp. He'd promised that the BT-2D would offer significantly improved range and vastly improved load-carrying capability, while coming in at a gross weight of no more than 16,500 pounds. Weight is the arch nemesis of any designer, and to achieve his goal, he established a target figure that was underweight by 750 pounds and some very rigid design policies, such as a rule that no component could be overweight unless an equivalent amount was saved elsewhere. And to get to first flight on time, a rule that no design or fabrication decision would be allowed to remain unresolved overnight. A trip to the combat areas of the Pacific, where he interviewed air crews and maintenance personnel, reconfirmed his commitment to simplicity of design in order to eliminate weight and unnecessary complexity, as well as to reduce maintenance time by 50%. With this in mind, he convinced the Navy to let him eliminate an internal bomb bay, saving 200 pounds and permitting the airplane to carry a greater variety of external stores. The SBD had been configured with 6 fuel tanks. He saved another 270 pounds by consolidating this complex system into a single tank. And by the time the prototype XBT-2D made its first flight in March of 1945, he'd sliced a full 1,000 pounds off the guaranteed gross weight, thereby automatically increasing its load-carrying capability by an almost equivalent amount. Capable of carrying a bomb load nearly 5 times that of the SBD and delivering it with far greater precision, the XBT-2D, originally called the Dauntless II, proved itself to be everything the Navy had asked for in a dive bomber and torpedo attack airplane. But the recently redesignated AD Skyraider series of aircraft proved to be much more in the hostile skies over Korea. Adopted the A-1 in Vietnam because its relatively slow speed, long endurance, and proven ruggedness made it ideal for low-level helicopter escort and ground fire suppression duties. It probably gained its greatest fame flying extremely hazardous rescue missions under the call sign Sandy. The Sandys, flying in conjunction with Jolly Green Giant rescue choppers, took on the job of locating downed air crews airplane. Even as the first Skyraiders were coming off the production line back in 1945, their piston engines had been overtaken by new turbojet technology, which promised the performance to propel aircraft through the transonic and perhaps even into the supersonic region. The problem facing the aeronautical community was that no one knew anything about the transonic flight regime. Wind tunnels had proven useless. Thus, in conjunction with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, the military services decided to build research airplanes to gather the information. The Air Force opted for a radical rocket-powered design, the Bell X-1, while the Navy took a more conservative approach and awarded Douglas a contract to build 6 jet-propelled airplanes to be designated D-558. As design of these aircraft proceeded, Ed Heinemann and his team became aware of German wartime research into swept wings and convinced of the value of employing rocket power to probe the supersonic region. Thus, 3 of the airplanes were designated D-558-2, and a parallel design effort on these aircraft got underway as work on the D-558-1 proceeded. Heinemann and his design team were treading on new ground. They'd never worked on a jet design before, and thus once again, he opted for simplicity, wrapping a small, cigar-shaped fuselage around the 5,000-pound thrust power plant and employing conventional airfoils and flight control surfaces. After it was rolled out of the El Segundo plant in February of 1947, the Sky Streak, as it was called, was trucked up to Muroc Air Force Base on California's high desert, where in April, Douglas test pilot Gene May completed its maiden flight. The Sky Streak wasn't designed to set records. As he recalled later, Ed Heinemann never viewed it as anything more than a methodical way to obtain technical data. But that August, Navy test pilot Commander Turner Caldwell flew it to an official world speed record of 640 miles per hour, only to be surpassed less than a week later by Marine test pilot Major Marion Carl, who exceeded 650 miles per hour. This impressive performance was overshadowed less than 2 months later, when on October 14, 1947, the Air Force's Captain Charles E. Chuck Yeager flew the more radical rocket-powered X-1 through the sound barrier. But the Sky Streak went on to more than prove its worth, flying as Heinemann had intended, an extensive research program gathering invaluable data on transonic loads and flying qualities. In the meantime, the much more exotic D-558-2 commenced its flight test program at Muroc in February 1948. Initially configured with only a small 3,000-pound thrust jet engine, the airplane was woefully underpowered and unable to exceed 600 miles per hour. While performance with a combined jet and rocket boost system improved to a top speed of 720 miles per hour, the airplane was still far from realizing the potential which had been designed into it. That potential wouldn't begin to be unleashed until the concept of fuel-consuming ground takeoffs and the heavy hybrid propulsion system were discarded in favor of air launching a fully rocket-powered airplane. Only in this configuration did the D-558-2 truly become a sky rocket. Aerodynamicists predicted that it might be capable of speeds as high as Mach 1.6, but it would far surpass their expectations. During 1951, Douglas test pilot Bill Bridgman launched away from a modified B-29 7 times and completed a remarkable series of flights, including a record top speed of Mach 1.88 and an unofficial world altitude record of more than 79,000 feet. Then, in August 1953, Marine test pilot Marion Carl extended the Skyrocket's altitude record to more than 83,000 feet. Finally, on November 20th of that year, NACA test pilot Scott Crossfield sought to coax maximum performance out of the airplane and become the first man to fly Mach 2. Following launch, he ignited the engine and pulled into a climb. Flying a very carefully defined profile with great precision, he climbed to a peak altitude of 72,000 feet and then nosed over into a dive. And at 62,000 feet, became the first man to fly at twice the speed of sound, attaining a top speed of 1,291 miles per hour, or Mach 2.005. The flight was a milestone event in the history of aviation and a signal achievement both for the Skyrocket's pilot and for the modest, self-educated engineer who had led the team which designed it. Rolled out from the El Segundo plant in early 1948, enemy aircraft than any other Navy or Marine fighter. An experimental twin-turbine engine, producing a whopping 5,000 horsepower and driving a pair of huge, three-bladed contra-rotating propellers. The Skyshark demonstrated some very impressive performance. Takeoff in less than 300 feet, a 7,200 feet per minute rate of climb, more than doubling the Skyraider's performance, and a top speed of 500 miles per hour. Turboprop systems, however, were far more complex than pure jets, and their development, in fact, lagged far behind. The Skyshark program was plagued from the outset by turbine and gearbox failures and a host of other engine-related problems which delayed testing and caused some serious accidents. As far as Heinemann was concerned, he was through with all manner of props. And indeed, even before the Skyshark had commenced its flight trials, another, far more exotic Heinemann prototype was undergoing final assembly. It had been conceived in response to a 1947 Navy requirement for an interceptor capable of climbing from a standing start to 40,000 feet in 5 minutes. And it reflected just how far the turbojet and Heinemann had come in the 2 short years since the design of the F-3D. Turbojet technology had matured at a dramatic pace in terms of engine weight, thrust, and fuel efficiency. And Heinemann and his design staff were now able to capitalize on this, making use of all the latest aerodynamic theory and all of the work done on the Sky Streak and Sky Rocket to create a truly revolutionary design. Intrigued by captured German research into the high-performance advantages of tailless, delta-wing planforms, Heinemann and his team refined the concept into a modified Delta and came up with the rakish XF-4D Skyray. First flown at Edwards Air Force Base in January of 1951, it offered the Navy a performer which at last began to fulfill some of the promise of the turbojet revolution. Naval aviators had wanted a high-speed interceptor, and that's what Ed Heinemann gave them. In October 1953, Lieutenant Commander Jim Verdon went up in one of the prototypes and, flying on the deck, punched it into afterburner as he made 4 runs over a course at the Salton Sea in the Southern California desert. His speed for the 4 passes averaged out to over 752 miles per hour, and the Skyray thereby became the first carrier-borne aircraft ever to hold the world absolute speed record. Equally impressive, less than 2 weeks later, veteran Douglas test pilot Bob Rahn flew the same aircraft on the deck over a 100-kilometer closed course at Edwards Air Force Base and claimed yet another world's record as he banked around the course at an average speed of 728 miles per hour. Affectionately known as the Ford by the pilots who flew it, the F-4D was the first Navy fighter capable of Mach 1 in level flight, and as an interceptor, it far exceeded the Navy's original 5 minutes to 40,000 feet requirement, as it established 5 world time to climb records, including a climb to 40,000 feet in less than 2 minutes. The design of this airplane was a remarkable achievement, which brought Heinemann a well-earned, long overdue Collier Trophy in 1954. For many, this would have represented the pinnacle of a career, but not for Ed Heinemann. It was the largest and heaviest aircraft ever designed for routine carrier operations. Its genesis dated back to 1947, when the Navy issued specs for a long-range strategic bomber to be based on a projected new class of super carriers and capable of delivering the bulky 10,000-pound nuclear devices then in the inventory. The Navy had stipulated a maximum gross weight, including the weapon, of no more than 100,000 pounds. Ed Heinemann, however, didn't believe the supercarriers would ever be built, and thus, if the strategic bomber went into service, it'd have to operate from the much smaller existing Midway-class carriers, which could never accommodate a 100,000-pound airplane. Thus, while industry and Navy experts continued to insist that the 100,000-pound figure was probably close to the absolute minimum for the mission, Heinemann set about to design a much smaller airplane, and when, after preliminary studies, he said he could get the job done within a gross weight of 68,000 pounds, there were scoffers aplenty, and even the Navy was incredulous. His biggest problems stemmed from the heft of the 10,000-pound weapon, which required a cavernous bomb bay and had to be accessible from the cockpit so that one of the crew could arm it. Indeed, the whole logic of the design evolved from this consideration. It dictated, for example, the large, swept-back, shoulder-mounted wing, which in turn necessitated a narrow-track undercarriage retracting into the fuselage. As development proceeded, Heinemann stubbornly waged a constant battle against weight, and even extracted a promise from the Navy that for every pound of and because of his merciless war against weight, that it would have tremendous growth potential as well. Named the Sky Warrior, the airplane exceeded all expectations when it went to the fleet. Establishing a host of transoceanic and transcontinental speed records, the A-3D excelled in its nuclear deterrent role and ultimately operated off carriers at gross weights of up to 84,000 pounds. Moreover, like so many Heinemann airplanes, it proved remarkably adaptable to a wide range of additional missions. Thus, in Vietnam, Sky Warriors would figure prominently in such diverse roles as photo reconnaissance, mine laying, electronic countermeasures, and aerial refueling. Indeed, the soundness of the A-3D's design He initiated a study and found that for every pound of equipment or structure added to an airplane's original design, it had to grow an additional 10 pounds in order to maintain its original performance, speed, and range. The principal cause of this growth factor was, in his words, tack hammer engineering. Tacking on unnecessary additional systems, structure, and gadgetry, which, he explained, could be avoided with a little forethought. The cure, he said, was more diligent engineering, painstaking analysis of every single structural and system component in order to refine and simplify them to the maximum degree of efficiency. When the Navy asked if he could actually apply this philosophy to the design of a new jet attack bomber in 1952, he jumped at the chance. The spec called for a top speed of 580 miles per hour, an unrefueled combat radius of 400 miles, a 2,000-pound weapon load, and a max gross weight of less than 30,000 pounds. Confident he could exceed all of the performance goals while reducing the gross weight by more than half, he finalized his concept. And working with longtime El Segundo engineer and artist R.G. Smith, started roughing out a configuration design. And after considering a variety of shapes, structures, and entire configurations, the distinctive lines of the A-4D Skyhawk emerged from their efforts. While the configuration underwent extensive refinement, Heinemann laid down the law to every member of his design team. Eliminate the unessential and cut the weight of each component to the minimum without jeopardizing its integrity. Such an approach resulted in a single wing box structure, for example, which was only 27 feet in span, thus wouldn't require the weight and complexity of a folding mechanism, and which would serve as a single leak-proof integral fuel tank. By challenging every pound in the airplane, he proved that careful attention to detail spawned remarkable ingenuity. Carefully integrating all the avionics black boxes into a single primarily employed in close air support operations in the South. While in the North, they conducted a relentless interdiction campaign, and flying against some of the most heavily defended targets in history, they were used to conduct precision strikes against surface-to-air missile sites and a wide range of strategic targets. Indeed, throughout the first 4 years of the conflict, the Skyhawk provided the overwhelming bulk of Navy and Marine airstrike power, and demonstrating remarkable reliability, ultimately accounted for an estimated 1/3 of all naval and marine combat missions.